I'm Cheryl Hentz, here on the stage of the Grand Opera House in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. The Grand has been part of Oshkosh's cultural tapestry since it was built in 1883. Through the decades, this iconic building has undergone many changes. In the following 3 segments, we will examine those changes and hear about some of the Grand's most famous or infamous stories. In this segment, the Grand Oshkosh's director Joseph Ferlo and I will examine the history of this building, including many of the people who have performed here. So Joe, tell us about the history of the Grand. This is such a beautiful place. It has been here for how many years?
138. I think, if I'm doing my math right. It opened in August of 1883. Which makes it the oldest operating theater building in the state of Wisconsin. When I tell kids this, the way I put it into perspective is I tell them about 1883. The Eiffel Tower didn't exist. The Washington Monument was half built. Chester Arthur was president. The telephone, never mind these kind, but the kind that plugs into the wall, didn't exist. It makes the Grand older than the hamburger and older than Coca-Cola.
That's old.
That's old.
That's very old. So tell us a little bit about the history, how it came to be, what kinds of performances were held here back in the day.
As I recall, the women of Oshkosh played a big part in funding and creating the Grand. They were the driving force, which was unusual for that time. And of course, the Grand was built out of brick. Knowing Oshkosh's history and difficulty with fires, that was a really fine idea. And it was, at the time, Oshkosh was the 2nd largest city in the state. So it needed a Grand Opera House. And when I say a Grand Opera House, it's not only the original name, but also a descriptor. An opera house in general, like the Wagner here in town, was often a retail store on the 1st floor with a flat floor and a tiny little stage on the 2nd floor. But a Grand Opera House was built theatrically with the proscenium arch and the raked floor. So it's not only the name, but that's why there's so many Grand Opera Houses, because it was just a descriptor. Oshkosh felt it needed a Grand Opera House, and because Oshkosh was the 2nd largest city, we were a big stop on this circuit of the era, not just for opera or operetta, but also for personalities and actors and singers. It was very much the way my schedule is now, in terms of balance between theatrical and entertainment and community.
Was it owned privately at one time? It's my understanding that it was.
In fact, I think it was owned privately entirely until 1986.
And then the city became a full owner, part owner?
Yes, the city owns the building. We lease it from the city.
And what kind of performances were held there back then?
Let's see. There's a kind of a rogues list. It starts with Mark Twain, Harry Houdini, the Marx Brothers. Sarah Bernhardt did Shakespeare on this stage. Enrico Caruso sang opera from the stage. John Philip Sousa would bring his band through. It was definitely a who's who.
It sounds like it. Celeste Holm was another one.
So, it's interesting though, because when people talk about, now I've got the Four Phantoms or Jeff Daniels making regular visits here. In the first place, part of the reason is a guy like Jeff Daniels loves the fact that Mark Twain spoke on the stage. You know what I mean? That he just gets it. The Four Phantoms, Frank D'Ambrosio in particular, who has done over 6,000 performances as the Phantom and has sung all over the world, has said that this is the finest American hall that he has sung in.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I do know the acoustics here are unbelievably wonderful.
What I find amazing about it is, people used to say perfect, and of course there's no such thing as perfect acoustic. But William Waters, the architect, he built houses, he built community buildings, he built large community buildings, but he wasn't a theater architect. If I were able to sit down with him, my first question would be, were you lucky or did you get this right? I mean, he certainly had designed enough churches and assembly halls that I don't think he was lucky. But this particular configuration, this particular theater configuration, was not something, usually when you learn about historic theaters, it was a rap and rap theater, or it was, these architects churned out different theater buildings and they would pop up all over, all over the country. There is another William Waters, a sister to this building in Wisconsin, but he was not a theater designer and a theater architect. And so in that sense, the whole idea of how well this building plays is kind of a fun story.
Today, of course, you have all kinds of performances here. You have plays, you have individual acts like Jeff Daniels, there are musical acts, just a lot of different things. When did the decision get made to start having all these other kinds of performances here?
Very early on, I think. I remember reading an article that was put in front of me by a local historian, and it referred to one of my predecessors, John Williams, who was known as Honest John. And John was lamenting that he had trouble. He wanted to bring the finest acts to Oshkosh because they deserved it. But the trouble was, for what he had to pay for the act, he couldn't get enough people or a high enough ticket price to make that work, which is, of course, the exact same struggle that I have. And Honest John was the manager of the Grand at 1900, turn of the last century. So the business model and the problems and the challenges haven't changed much.
Yeah. There was a short period of time, some people refer to it as the dark years of the Grand, but there was a period of time when adult films were shown here. And so I think that that's not something that a whole lot of people know. I mean, if you're from Oshkosh, I think maybe you know it.
Every once in a while, someone brave enough admits that they had been in
right?
the building during the time.
Yeah.
But generally,
how did that come to be?
I suspect this is somewhat speculation, but as the theater changed hands over the years and changed names from the Grand Opera House to the Grand Theater to the Granada to the Civic Theater to the Grand Theater, which is what most people still refer to it as it changed owners and it changed its way, the challenges would happen. And I think it's entirely likely, controversial as the statement might be, that had not that owner purchased this theater and operated it for those 4 years, that it might not have survived to be saved.
So it was in financial straits then?
There's always a struggle, I think, and even through the 50s, the community players were doing shows here, there were community concerts, the formula was the same, but the struggle, I suspect, was still the same. And if it was a matter of selling or losing it, then selling it was the thing to do. I'm not sure, because as I follow Oshkosh history, that would be about the time that the lovely Athearn Hotel across the street from us was determined to be beyond renovation and torn down. This easily could have been the same fate, And the Athearn was, not everybody understands the reference. I know you will when I say it. The Athearn was our Penn Station. Penn Station was torn down in New York, and it created the National Preservation movement. The Athearn being torn down, it seems to me when people talk to me about it, that the dust hadn't settled before people regretted that. And so when the Grand, even in its adult movie configuration, began to show signs of disrepair, the rally cry was, not another Athearn, it's not going to happen again. And so I always think of that era as being, obviously I wouldn't program that way, but that was a bridge in programming that got us to, and then it would still be years of not being used in that fashion, although, as you said, there were still performances happening. The photographs from the theater during that time are astounding to me, because I've only seen it like this. But I think that era, while it was not a dark era, it's a colorful era. And but without it, I'm not sure that we make it from the 50s into the 60s.
Yes. Supposedly, there was a tunnel back in the day that ran from the Grand to the Athearn Hotel. And there are some people who say, yes, a tunnel existed. There are others who say, well, I don't know if it ever existed. I never saw it. But there are photographs that clearly show something having been bricked over. If there was a tunnel system, well, first of all, I guess, what have you heard about it?
Well, I looked, because it would have come right up in the vault of the bank, and believe me, that was the first thing I wanted to do, was know if there was a tunnel to a bank vault. I would have found it. Like you, I have heard stories from people I respect that say there were tunnels. There was a tunnel between the two. For every one of those stories, I hear someone say, "No, that's just a story with all of that was going on in the street, and under the streets, and whatever. That wasn't possible." What I do know is that whether it extended to the Athearn or not, Oshkosh did have the Grand did have a down under business. You would from the side of the street here, you would go down on an exterior stair. There are a few of these buildings still in town, and you'd go into the basement where there were shops in the basement, kind of like the ghost stories. You could give a logical explanation, or you could tell the more colorful story. I usually adapt. I usually go for the more colorful story, but logically, perhaps I think some of the bricked up things in our basement are very clearly from an exterior stairwell and a doorway for the businesses that were down there. If there was a tunnel, it would have existed in the corner of the building where there's now another stairway. So there wouldn't be any evidence in the basement for us to see, which is not to say that before the building was renovated, there wasn't evidence to see.
Right. And I, even though I've not ever seen a tunnel here, I have been in other tunnels in the city. So the fact that we have other tunnels, I don't know, suggests to me that there very well could have been. And it would have served a number of different purposes, I guess. Julie Johnson, who is a member of the local historical society, wrote a wonderful book on basement businesses here in the city. And she has an entire chapter dedicated to whether or not there was a tunnel here.
She is much more of an authority than I.
Yes.
Really, I send people to Julie when they ask me about tunnels.
Yeah, and so she suggests in her book that if a tunnel did in fact exist, it would have served a number of purposes. It would have helped to keep the performers away from the glare of the public. When they were finished here and they were going back to their hotel.
You would also keep their long dresses out of the mud.
I was just going to say that, because we had dirt streets, and if it rained, it was mud.
I wonder, though, too, I think about this, and I wonder if it's not a question of if there was a tunnel, as much as it's a question of when there was a tunnel. Because in the 50s, there was a renovation of the Grand that moved the entrance of the building to the corner where the tunnel probably was located. So I wonder if at that time, when the entrance became street level and you went either down to the restrooms or up to the lobby, if whatever evidence was there was covered or even obliterated in the 50s, which doesn't mean that there weren't tunnels before then. Another use of tunnels back in the earlier days would be Prohibition.
Sure.
Theaters were, we're a disreputable lot, we theater people, and theaters themselves were often bootlegging hubs in their communities. So I wonder if what colorful history that we might have. I wish I could put my hand on it, but the closest theory that I have that also works with Julie's research is that perhaps there were tunnels during the first 75 years of the Grand, that during that renovation of the 1950s were disrupted, and evidence was probably destroyed.
Also, another rumor, as long as we're talking about tunnels and the speculation there, there have been rumors floating around for as long as I can remember, and beyond that, that there is a ghost here in the Grand. What have you heard about that?
It's interesting, the ghosts here, no one seems to be malevolent. Mischievous, maybe, but there's a young man who was allegedly buried in the coal bin, who is quite mischievous in the basement levels. One of the owners had a dog who folks have heard bark. Other dogs here on stage have reacted. And then in the balcony, one of the seats in the balcony, there is a woman. We call her Rose. She's sitting in the seat in the balcony in her Victorian 1880s dress with a Bohemian Girl, the first show program in her hand, waiting for the show to start. And I've heard tell that early on when the Grand opened in the 80s and 90s, that patrons were noted to comment that it was great that we had reenactors in the building. And
so if she's sitting along with this friend in one of the seats up there, do you not sell tickets to those seats?
Oh no, we sit. They sit right on her lap.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I don't tell people about that. You know, you just you never know. Yeah. The young man in the basement. This is I'm sure you would ask me if I've had any personal experiences, and I have not. I'm a little annoyed about it. But I once had a colleague, a friend in the community, a respected business person, who felt she had a connection to the spirit world. And she asked, when I met her and we were working, and she said, can I just wander around the basement sometime? You'd be surprised how many people ask that.
Really?
So so I brought her to the building, and I brought her down to the basement, to this area of activity. And I said, I'll just go sit on the top of the stairs, and if you need anything, yell. I went to the top of the stairs, and a few minutes later, she yelled. And it was a very unladylike expression, I might say. I went down the stairs, and she said that apparently this young man, finding himself in the basement with a young woman, decided to explore a little bit. And so she was admonishing the young man for being a young man. Yeah. But it didn't take long before I was running down those stairs to see what was up, And it is like the tunnel stories. There are people who I respect who insist that they've had interactions with spirits in the Grand. You can create a logical explanation.
Sure.
But theaters are places of imagination. What fun is that? Let's go with the ghost stories.